Today we are in historic downtown Sanford, sitting in the alley, just really kind of a nostalgic feeling here because it has had music artists, especially with the blues genre, come through here several times. And I'm sitting here today talking with Bryan Bassett, who actually worked for King Snake Records, big time record company here, independent label in Sanford, just one of the biggest influential and pivotal role playing labels here for blues in Sanford. So let's get into this interview because we need to learn more about King Snake Records. Tell me about King Snake Records and how you came into King Snake Records.
When I relocated from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which in the mid 80s, I was looking around for musicians, and I had a very successful career in the Pittsburgh area playing clubs, and then we had a hit record with a Wild Cherry Band. And I was just looking for the musician groups around here in Florida and really couldn't find any until I saw a concert advertisement at Daytona Community College at the time. And it was the Midnight Creepers. And so I went to the show. They were fantastic, and I went backstage and introduced myself, and I had the great pleasure of meeting Bob Greenlee, who really became the focus of my next over a decade of music production and playing. And I met a lot of longtime friends there. Ernie Lancaster was the guitar player in the band and became my studio guitarist along with myself. We were the two guitar players for over 10 years together. Mark Hodson, one of the best harmonica players in the country. And I played with him live performances and everything. Bob invited me to his studio, which at the time was a side building from his house, and it was garages on the bottom and a home studio on the top. It was a converted apartment. And the very first record I did there, they were in the process of recording Noble Thin Man Watts, quite the famous saxophonist from DeLand. And he's an interesting story all on himself. I met him, he was so funny. I got to play on the record and write a couple songs on it with Noble. But of course, he was really famous in the 50s as an instrumentalist, saxophone player. He had, I think, two big hits, Hard Times and Jukin'. He was the band leader at the Sugar Ray Robinson Club, the famous boxer in Harlem during the 50s. His wife was a great singer, and but they were DeLand natives, and so he was the first artist I met when I was hanging with Bob. I had some engineering experience, and Bob decided at that time to convert the studio into a more professional setting. So it wasn't just, a living room, amps in the bedroom. We tore the whole place out, and Bob constructed a very, top flight studio. Pete Carr, who was a Daytona native and a famous Muscle Shoals guitarist, was he had moved back from Muscle Shoals to Daytona, and Bob asked him to engineer there, and I was the second engineer at the time. And so me and Pete did several of our first releases together, and I learned so much from him. And, he played on hundreds of hit records. Yeah. In fact, Pete asked me to help him move one time, and he had more gold and platinum records than we could carry. It was me and my friend. It took like 4 trips to get them all. Played with Simon and Garfunkel, Bob Seger, Rod Stewart. All those hits out of Muscle Shoals. And but Bob and I, we hit it off right away because we discovered we both had national record label experiences. He was in a band called the Root Boy Slim and the Sex Change Band, and he was called Bob Rattlesnake Rattles,
yes.
Right? That was his handle. Ernie's was Ernie Sex Ray Lancaster, so, and they were a pretty extreme band. And Root Boy Slim himself was a classmate of Bob's. They were both Yale graduates, and he was sort of like a rock poet. I don't know. It's hard to describe. You just have to Google Root Boy Slim and catch some of his music. But they were signed to Warner Brothers, and and I had my experience with Wild Cherry and Epic Records. And Bob was really, he was actually an All-American football player. And I played football in high school, but he was an All-American football player. They tried to draft him to the Miami Dolphins.
Really? Yeah,
and but he didn't want to. He had some knee injury, and his love was music, and in particular blues music, and in more particular southeastern blues, what we would call swamp blues. He, Lazy Lester, Lightning Slim, Lightning Hawkins.
Smokehouse.
Yeah, Smokehouse was the next generation tradition, but so that kind of a sound was what Bob was interested in, and that's what we engineered. And then he went on to look I look out for new artists, young artists, to populate his new record label, King Snake Records. And we were an independent record label, so one of the great things about being an independent record label, and one of the frustrations, to me, my frustrations, when I moved from Pittsburgh, I had a great band there, we couldn't get a record deal. And to have a great band and great songs and no one could sign you, you really needed a record company at that time to promote and distribute and manufacture your records. So the idea of being part of an independent record label, which we could see projects through from beginning to end to release, to get them out to, you know, we didn't sell millions of records, but we sold thousands. And we had NPR radio stations and, you know, those kind of collegiate radio stations, blues radio stations that, you know, that would play our music. And we also, you know, had records that we could put in our artist's hand that they could sell off the bandstand as they traveled. So that whole concept was great, and that was Bob's dream, and he actually fulfilled it. I mean, we had dozens of artists and made hundreds of records over the course of 15 years. At one point, we were doing 10 to 12 records a year.
Wow.
And bands like Smokehouse. And then we found Kenny Neal, who's quite a big blues star right now. And over the years, he has, you know, many blues awards.
And his father.
And his father, Rayful Neal, who knew all the original guys, Buddy Guy, and you know, all the first generation blues guys. They were all thing. And Lucky Peterson, who was one of the greatest keyboard player, guitar player, musicians I ever met. He was one of our second artists that we signed. Ended up playing with Etta James, having his own band, and had an amazing career. So he and his father, James Peterson, we did a record with him, who had a blues club in Tampa, and all the old guys knew each other. You know, once again, Buddy Guy and all them would come down and play his blues club. So, you know, it was a really interesting time. Pete Carr was behind the board as I was, and I would sometimes play guitar, you know, maybe rhythm, and behind Kenny, and I played on almost all the records that we made at some point. And that was the family that we started creating, and all the session musicians were really, you know, Ernie in particular, you know, and I think Albert Bayshore was our original drummer, but also Scott Corwin was one of the, became a lifelong friend of mine and bandmate. He was part of the Midnight Creeper band that I saw that initial night, and we had a band called Blue House, and we toured up and down the coast. And all our bands had this sort of regional thing, you know. Dr. Hector and the Groove Injectors, one of our artists, would go all the way up into the Carolinas, and they had a style of music up there called, you know, it was like dance, rhythm, and blues, you know. And they sort of specialized in that. And Kenny Neal, and you know, our reach was probably over to Baton Rouge in Louisiana, all of Florida, of course. We'd go spend time in the Keys, you know, we'd be a house band, and several clubs in the Key West, the Sloppy Joe's in particular. And that was our business, and we had a community of musicians that I eventually met, and I was so happy to, because we became friends forever.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. You know, Bob Greenlee, when anybody who is from Sanford, they know King Snake Records. For people who don't, Bob Greenlee was a saving grace for blues music here in Sanford, and I mean, you saw it firsthand.
I was, and I was there from the beginning. You know, not the very beginning, cause, you know, but Bob had done 1 or 2 records and had a studio going. But when he developed his independent label, that was the beginning of it, because we were actively searching for local musicians. You know, as far as Jacksonville, as you know, and over to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and of course Central Florida musicians, and so it became a hub, and everybody, there's probably a group of 20 or 25 of us, Mike Galloway, Dan Walters, that we all played in various combinations. You know, if you're doing a club, you know, we need 3 guys or 4 guys, you know, who's available. Everybody knew the same 40 songs. We always backed up Noble Watts. We did a lot of live concerts backing up Noble. And I didn't go to do the European tour, but they actually, Bob took a group of musicians and a review setting over to France, I believe. They did a lot of playing over there. And so we, you know, became combination. I played with Mark Hodson a lot. A later addition was my friend Steve Dees, who sort of took over the mantle lately of doing what Bob did, which would be a producer. And Bob was the producer. We worked quick, and all the bands were well rehearsed. We didn't have computers back in the day; it was all on tape, and so time was of the essence. And bands would be well rehearsed, and we could knock out, you know, 2 or 3 records in a month sometimes from beginning to end. And Bob would come in and they would discuss the record, how it's going to go, what songs we're going to do. And then he would leave the nuts and bolts up to me and Pete. Eventually Pete went back to Muscle Shoals, and friends of mine from Pittsburgh decided to come and join me down here. Bert Foster, who I played in bands with up in Pittsburgh, and Warren King, one of the most famous guitar players from the Pittsburgh area, came down. Warren was a great engineer as well as a great guitar player. Bird was a great singer and songwriter and a fantastic drummer. And so they became sort of the core of our session musicians after a while. And but it was great. You know, it was a lot of work and it was a lot of fun, and it really created a community of blues musicians, particularly in Central Florida, but in Florida in general, and in Sanford in particular. I mean, this was the hub of it. You know, not too many miles from where we're sitting right now. And we're in the Alley, which is a blues club, still promoting the blues in this local area, which is fantastic to have a venue still committed to that style of music.
Absolutely.
And really, blues is pretty much the predominant, you know, music. Maybe it's like I was so involved in it, it seems that it was like the only style of music. I'm sure it's not, but you know, I play in a rock band now, and I have for 20 years. But I kept my hand in the blues, and I think all blues musicians or rock musicians of my era are blues influenced anyhow. You know.
Absolutely. The Chitlin tour has come. They've had musicians come through this spot right here, the Alley. But the Chitlin tour, I mean, that was a big thing with King Snake. What was it like?
And that was, you know, it was a lot of hours in a van.
Touring.
But there was a list of clubs, you know, that we all passed around, and especially with our artists that were signed, you know, we would work out a circuit all the way up into Atlanta sometimes. But we had a good blues club. There's a couple good ones in Jacksonville, a couple good ones in Tallahassee. And so once we had a record release coming out on one of our artists, we would set up a tour, you know, for them. And of course, they would do a lot of the work themselves, but we would also assist with promotion. And it was a circuit, and that was the way of life. You tour most of the year and come back to King Snake, you know, and record another record and go do it again. And that was the lifestyle, you know.
So when people think about Sanford, you know, the first thing a lot of people don't think is blues music. I mean, when you hear blues music, you think, you know, Louisiana, Baton Rouge, and places like that. What was the difference here in the sound? I know there's a thing with swamp blues, and I mean, the Cadillac.
Cadillac in the Swamp.
Cadillac in the Swamp. You know, that was by Smokehouse.
Right. I produced many records with Smokehouse, and they were. That was their style, was swamp blues, because it has a lot of echo on it.
Voodoo Who?
Right. Who do you?
Yes, who do you? That's it.
Who do you? And then there's a lot of voodoo in there. And, well, no, you were right on there, because that's in there as well. But that's the sound from Excello Records from the 50s. Lots of echo. A lot of times, not even a lot of drums. They use some wood blocks, a lot of percussion.
A lot of harmonica.
A lot of harmonica, very sparse. Spooky stories, you know.
Yeah.
And so that was their style, and I engineered and produced 4 records with them. And it was my ex-roommate Robert Thomas was the guitar player, who I played in several bands with, but that was his primary band for a long time. Anthony Packrat Thompson, I think, and he was a harmonica player, singer, you know, and just a fantastic voice and right in that style, you know. And they never deviated from that, which was sort of an interesting thing about blues and swamp blues in particular. It had very set parameters of soundscape and instrumentation and arrangements, and you didn't go too far afield of that, or else you popped out of the genre. So that was interesting, having those confines to record. You know, you knew you had to keep it in a certain style and a certain subject matter for it to qualify to be in that kind of a group of music. But we also had many different styles of music. We were a production house for singers and blues artists. Some of them more, like a couple like Troy Turner, led more to the Stevie Ray Vaughan vein, or electric blues.
Huge fan of Stevie Ray Vaughan. So when we're talking about how the Sanford sound of blues, you know, it had a very notable sound, but you guys had plenty of other types of artists that came through King Snake Records.
Absolutely. Bob had a real affinity for the southeastern swamp blues sound, and that was what he liked to produce and work on. But we had many other artists that we produced and recorded, and that weren't on our label. In fact, most of our artists we tried to move up to a larger independent label for distribution, the big one at the time being Alligator Records, run by Bruce Iglauer. And several of our artists, Sapphire, the Uppity Blues Women, I recorded that record, and that was picked up by Alligator. Kenny Neal, we did the first record on King Snake, but all his subsequent albums, 4 or 5 more, were on Alligator. Wow. Lucky Peterson, all his records came out on Alligator, and we did Daddy Kinsey, who was the father of one of the guys from Bob Marley's band. Yeah. It came out on Blacktop. And we did a couple records for Rounder. So there was all these small independent blues labels, all had slightly different sounds, some more folk blues, some more Chicago blues, which was the Alligator sound. And so we, welcomed those artists in. Plus we had visiting guests like Gatemouth Brown, fame, and Taj Mahal came in. Wow. A guy named Razzie Bailey, he was from Nashville, but was sort of an R&B singer. Alex Taylor was one of our artists, James Taylor's older brother, who was more like a blues, like the Blues Brothers kind of style, more of that kind of R&B blues. We did albums with him. So it was pretty diversified. And then one of my fellow engineers, Rick Bailey, who was a pretty famous local musician in Orlando and a great engineer, teacher at Full Sail University as well. He was a great engineer, and he was, I can't not mention him because we worked on many albums together. And Ace Moreland was Arkansas. So he had more of a country,
southern rock
feel
kind
of feel to him. But he was a great songwriter, great guitarist, and a great engineer. And so when I started touring more with Foghat, and I became more of a mix engineer, I would come in at the end of say the month, and they would have 3 or 4 records, and I would do more mixing instead of actual recording. And Ace, Warren, Rick, we had an engineer, Andrew McKinney, I think was his name. And so that's how it progressed. And the more I started traveling nationally, I became more of a mix engineer for Bob and a co-producer on some records. But it was just a lively, there was never a dull moment there. There was always somebody in recording. Yeah. And Bob was always on the lookout for young talent. And, money wasn't an object for Bob, which I admired as well. It was all very artistic. His family was wealthy. And so I don't think we ever lost money, but we didn't make millions of dollars or anything. But what we did was provide an environment for young artists and our established artists that we signed to continue their career, get product on the street, and have an enjoyable, productive musical life. That was the goal, really.
I've even read that Bob Greenlee had an affinity for finding R&B artists that people had quote unquote forgotten about, and bring them, like in the 80s, and brought them back just to revitalize, the hope for their career too.
Right, and I think that was the beginning, the germ of the idea was Noble Thin Man Watts, who was retired in DeLand and, playing a little bit, but that was one of Bob's initial goals, was to revitalize his career. He was a big fan, and he was a big star in his day. Yeah. And that was the beginning of it, and Bob always, kept an eye out. We did a Rufus Thomas record, an old R&B guy. Walking the Dog, of course, that was his big hit in the 50s. So we did a record with him, and just keeping, Lazy Lester too. His career was in the Sunset Stage.
I'm a man.
And and he was a fun guy. Bob had a fishing pond out back, and Lazy Lester would rather fish than record. So
wow.
we used to have to, hey, Lazy, come in. It's time, time to do some vocals. And,
he lived up to his name then,
exactly.
Is what you're saying. Except for when it came to music.
Never thought of it that way, but yeah.
Well, lazy fishing true. Days,
Exactly. And then the fact that we recorded, Kenny's father, Rafe O'Neill, and Lucky's father, James Peterson. These were bluesmen from the first generation, along with so many others, all the B.B. King, Albert King, that we all, grew up listening to. I always found it interesting as a young person in Pittsburgh, and when all the British invasion bands started hitting America, Cream, and especially the blues rock oriented one, Fleetwood Mac with Peter Green, John Mayall, with so we were listening. That's what was exciting me as a young musician and a young guitar player. And then you start looking at the song credits and figuring out that all the English musicians were totally enthralled with American blues artists. Robert Johnson and all the rest of Albert King, Freddie King, Otis Rush. America had sort of forgotten about them, and we sort of rediscovered them when the British musicians started bringing it back to us, all rocked up. And we're like, who's Albert King, and and all of a sudden, those blues artists started touring with the rock acts, and it revitalized their career.
Yeah.
So it's almost a blues tradition that Bob was following by, supporting the older artists that were the foundation of blues music.
Well, yeah, exactly, because you wouldn't have that music without the foundation of the music itself, that sound, their voices. Even when you go into newer artists like Dyer Davis, he's a big up and coming younger artist, and when I say younger, his voice really took me back for a second, because I thought to myself, this guy's like 20 something? Are you kidding me?
He has an old soul voice.
He does, and he was inspired by different people over the years, and it just shows that the foundation is always going back to the root, and that's why we sample too.
And that's a blues tradition, and Buddy Guy is a perfect example of that. Our current lead singer, Scott Holt, played with Buddy Guy for over 10 years. And the reason he ended up in the band, because Scott, as a young man, was getting into the blues, and Buddy was playing in town, and his dad got in touch with Buddy at a hotel, said, "Do you mind if you have a meeting with my son?" And he was still probably like 16 or 17, 18, like a young guy. Buddy said, "Sure." And Scott went, and before you know it, he was on tour with Buddy. Buddy took him under his wing, and we just played. Buddy's in his 80s, I think now, and he's still like a fireball. But we did a cruise with him a year or two ago, and he had a young kid, and his father, brought the young kid up, and he's a little, about this big in a firebrand, on the guitar, and he's still doing that mentoring thing.
Wow.
So that's a tradition, I think, passing the blues on. I mean, I think that's how it got passed on, the songs, or, a lot of times it's hard to find who wrote this original old blues song, because it was passed on orally, and everybody played their own version of it. So that's definitely a blues tradition. And Bob was, of that mind too, find the young guys and pass the music on. There's always talk about, I think the blues is dead, and then you have somebody like Stevie Ray come around and, some years ago and revitalize the whole thing, and Derek Trucks, he's a local guy, came into King Snake Studios when he was like 12 or 13, had a band around town, and when you heard him play, it was like he was channeling Duane Allman. I mean, it was so fantastic at such a young age, true child prodigy. And now the Tedeschi Trucks Band are, huge. And once again, it's, a young guy getting encouragement and being taught the ropes and coming up through the ranks.
Continuing that legacy for sure.
I think it's a great thing.
King Snake Records, you saw so many iconic people come through the door and record, and you worked on their records with them. But what was it about performing here locally in Sanford that was different from any other place that you went?
I think it became a community of not only musicians but also audience and fans of the blues, and the support of the local clubs around town that would have the musicians play there. It just became a community of like-minded people that loved that kind of music, and it was very active, and it supported the whole thing. I mean, it was a very energy circle. We made the music, you came, see it, the club supported it, and that's why it just became a thing. At the time, when I was playing in these blues bands, we were playing all over the place. Then Jacksonville had a great blues jazz festival, so our band would expand from 4 or 6 to sometimes 10 with a horn section, 2 keyboard players. I mean, we could blow up into a big giant blues band, and it was just that community support, for the local musicians, and everybody, every individual person had their group of fans that would follow them everywhere.
Yeah.
And then word of mouth, and of course all the musicians were really good, so that's a big part of it, and that's why I think the city supported it all.
Well, when I called you, and because I said to you, this little bird told me when I mentioned the name King Snake Records, because hello, it's all Sanford, right? Little bird, Billy Chapin, I'm gonna call him out now. He said, yeah, Bryan worked there for over 15 years, and so when I called you that day and I said, hey, King Snake Records, where did those three words take you in that moment?
To most of my life, really, sitting behind a desk. You know, but it's funny, there's so many pictures of people at King's Neck. I'm like, where am I in all these pictures? Oh, I'm working. You know, I'm behind the mixing console. You know, everybody's taking pictures. I'm like this. But yeah, a lot of my, you know, I spent 8, 10, 12 hours a day, 5, 6 days a week, you know, in that little control room. But it was a really great time, and it was a fulfilling time. Like I said, we were producing records, so that meant a lot to me. And I made a lot of friends, lifelong friends. And I still play music with them, and we still talk, you know. And a friend of ours, Tom Klein's doing a documentary, actually, about King Snake. He said he probably won't get to it till he retires, but because someone dumped a lot of footage on him and a lot of pictures and a lot of information. But he's sifting through it.
Nice.
So I'm anxious for that because a lot of the principals are gone now. You know, we lost Bob in '04. You know, Ernie and a lot of my friends, Eric, Ernie. You know, Ace. Yeah. And so there's, I think me, Mike Galloway, Rick Bailey. There's about, you know, half a dozen of us that really remember the King Snake experience. So I'm glad we're talking about it. I think it's really a historical, particularly local history.
Right.
But, you know, we're also a national concern, and we broke a lot of national acts. So I'm glad that someone's working to preserve that history. We were sort of like a Muscle Shoals, only not quite as successful. But, you know, we were successful by our own metrics. But
right.
Muscle Shoals had a lot of hit records and a lot of big stars. But, I mean, we had the same concept. It was, you know, that in-house music, a lot of in-house musicians, you know, making music for a lot of talented people.
When you look at that recording studio, you saw it from being constructed, and then you look at it now. I know that it doesn't exist anymore, but the building is still there. Right. And you see the history there. What do you think that means for this city? I mean, the city's full of history, number one.
It is, and I hope that we had some people that took a lot of photos. So I think I would love to see someone do some kind of a coffee table book of the interiors of that studio, because they don't exist anymore. And you know, after Bob passed, and you know, his daughter Martha tried to keep the studio going for a little bit, but you know, the soul of it was gone with Bob Wood, and I think it's been converted back into an, you know, apartment, so it's no longer a studio. But you know, I see the outside of the building, and I have some great memories. I remember when they were filming a movie here in Sanford, Rosewood. Remember that movie? It was about, you know, a historical event.
I'm a music person. I'm really bad with watching movies. But
we did, yeah.
Music.
But Wynton Marsalis, it was Vig Rhames was in the movie,
okay.
And you know, and it was a historical piece, you know, about racial violence, and but Wynton Marsalis came down, and the director came to the studio, and a lot of pretty famous musicians were doing the soundtrack for it while we were there. And they're all out in our little courtyard. You know, it's a side building, big house with a basketball court in the middle. And they're all playing basketball, you know. You know, so that kind of environment, you know, and to see things like that, those are the kind of memories I have, you know, people that pass through. And, yeah, so when I think back of it, it's a lot of work, a lot of music, and a lot of friends.
Those are three great things, though.
Yeah,
all part of good part of your career and your life so far. So, when we talk about you know, establishments that have kept blues going, we're sitting in one of them, and you're no stranger to that stage right behind us.
Right. Yeah, I've been here a few times, and so yeah, it's nice to be here. And Chris, you know, he's such a great guy. And, you know, it's nice to have places like this. I mean, that keeps the blues going, and particularly in a small town, more than anything, are venues that support it, and the local audiences that come out to see the musicians. So I'm so glad it's here. And I just want to mention the sign behind me. Yeah, the stage. The Ronnie Bird Foster stage. Well, he was our session drummer and my friend since the 60s in Pittsburgh. I played in several bands with him. He had a famous band that was on Columbia Records called The Silencers. And then we had a band together called Red Hot and Blue right before I came back to Florida. And so he eventually came down and became a very important part of the King Snake story, and obviously left an impression on this venue and in Florida music fans' minds for them to name the stage after him. So he was quite a performer. He actually could have gone Blue Blay, because he could put on a tuxedo and sing, you know, sing in that kind of Frank Sinatra style.
Wow.
He had a great crooning voice, but he was also a fantastic drummer and on many of our records.
So whenever you think about, you know, people when they look at Sanford and they're saying, music scene, we all know it has a really big music scene in historic downtown Sanford. What do you hope to see for the future of Sanford and blues as a whole?
I think that to just continue this live performance, and there's a couple venues. They built one in DeLand. That's an outdoor stage named for Noble Thin Man Watts. The Ritz Theater over there, which is has a name change from when I played there, but I played there with Bo Diddley and several times, and several other, the Birds, and it used to be a big menu. It's an old theater, but it became a music hall. So, you know, preserving those kind of venues, theaters, and as I tour around with Foghat, I love to see the Preservation Society saving some of these old theaters, because they'll never build them like that again.
Right.
Some of the ones we go into are so beautiful, and they're fantastic to play. You know, there's not a bad seat in the house, and the acoustics are great. So that kind of mindset in any kind of small town to preserve their music venues, I think is important. You know, for the culture of the city. You know, people want things to do, and going to see a blues band is one of the best things you can do.
There's history all over the walls, and I mean, if the walls could speak.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the thing about particularly old blues venues. I mean, they go back generations. You know,
We're sitting in a 1930s building right now, and I said, you know, when I thought about King Snake Records, I thought to myself, where could be a really good setting to sit here and talk to you about it? And this is the first place. And then I contacted Chris, he made it happen, and you see the walls, you see all the pictures, you see the writing. It's perfect.
And I remember one club in particular was in Jacksonville. I think it was called Applejacks, and it was an old building like this, wood floors, old kind of cushiony seats. Sounded fantastic in there, and then along the way someone came in and remodeled the whole thing and destroyed all the character.
No.
It never sounded the same, and so we were all disappointed with that. Yeah, so I mean, I think preservation of these kind of buildings, particularly music halls, is really important.
You have just been a plethora of information. You're always the best storyteller. When I had you on Riff on This, and then when you know, you did a phenomenal interview. Thank you so much for that. And then I called Billy, and when he said your name, I was just like, yes, because I knew it was going to be a fantastic interview. And I really appreciate all your knowledge and everything that you've done for blues music here in Sanford. So,
well, thanks. You know, it's been a lifelong pleasure of mine to be in the blues community locally, and I'm so happy that you're taking the time to bring it out to the people out there and let them know how important it was for this community.
absolutely.
And proud of it, and so glad to be a part of it, and thanks for the interview.
Well, we are proud to have you, but before we go, the record that just was 17 weeks on the blues charts with Foghat, what is it? Because people need to listen to it.
Oh, it's called Sonic Mojo. We just released it in November. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard Blues charts. And much to our surprise, it stayed on till just last week, 17 weeks on the top 10. Very unusual for a legacy band. You know, we always hope to get on the charts for a week or two, but this one has had some staying power. So thank you for all the Foghat fans out there supporting it, and the radio stations playing it, particularly Bluesville and XM Sirius.
You can catch you on tour, that's for sure.
That's right, and go to foghat.com and to see us live. We're doing a lot of blues.
Yes, you are. Singing the blues, but having fun doing it.
That's right.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.